Where we last left off, the ancient Egyptian New Kingdom was thriving under Thutmose IV, who had the privilege of looking inward and focusing on internal affairs due to the peace his father had made with the Mitanni. Thutmose IV appointed a viceroy for Egypt's conquered lands. The next pharaoh, Amenhotep III, was the inheritor of a sun-blessed throne and of a nation at unprecedented heights in its history, the Pax Aegyptica, if you will. Amenhotep III ruled for 37 years and never once went on campaign during his long reign. He was the greatest builder of his dynasty, and all of Egypt echoed to the sounds of workers' chisels once more. This pharaoh was particularly pious, and focused much of his work on honoring Egypt's many gods. For instance, he ordered the first tomb chapel built for the sacred Apis bull, who was revered in Memphis as the incarnation of the creator god Ptah. He also oversaw the construction of a new shrine to the creator god Khnum. This Amenhotep pushed the concept of divine kingship even further, and exalted the cult of the sun. He took pains to bring every major religious cult in Egypt under the rays of the sun cult. For example, he promoted the worship of baboons to the priests of Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom, scribes, and the moon. Baboons were considered sacred to Thoth, but also to the sun god Ra, due to their habit of shrieking in the morning as the sun rose. In Crocodilopolis, the crocodile god Sobek was combined with Ra to create Sobek Ra. There was also a self-serving motive for all of this. Amenhotep III was simultaneously giving himself epithets such as Ra's chosen one and heir of Ra. By associating himself directly with Ra while also making Ra the most important god in Egypt, he was aggrandizing the pharaoh's power and position tremendously. At the temple of Apetsit in Thebes, he added massive gateways to the temple enclosure and also adorned the buildings with hundreds of sculptures, erecting 700 statues to the lion goddess Sekhmet, who was likewise associated with Ra. On the western bank of the Nile, opposite of Thebes, he had built a massive mortuary temple to himself. Almost nothing survives of it now save for two massive 60-foot-tall statues of the king. Today they are known as the Colossi of Memnon, named after the Trojan war hero Memnon who came from Egypt to fight against Troy. Greek visitors during the Ptolemaic period believed that these statues represented this hero, and they are still known by his name. The king held the most extravagant and decadent jubilees for himself, until his very unexpected death of unknown causes. Nobody in Egypt could have predicted the royal revolution that would sweep the country in his aftermath. At first, nothing much seemed out of place. A fourth Amenhotep inherited his father's throne, and as usual made his own additions to the Temple of Apetsit. However, very soon he was beginning to unveil his radical ideas. East of the Temple of Apetsit, he built a temple to the sun god, not Ra nor Amun, but the sun disk itself, named Aten. This temple, named Gempa Aten, was a show of things to come. During his reign, there was a vast shift in the style of royal statuary and relief. Amenhotep IV rebelled against the stoic and aloof style of his predecessors, and opted for a style that distorted his figure in order to display his separation from normal humans. In relief and painting, the sun disk was shown handing down ankhs, which were a symbol of life, down to the royal family. His first jubilee was held in the Gempa Aten temple, and afterward he changed his name to reflect his reformed theology. Amenhotep, which means Amun is at peace, became Akhenaten, which means effective of Aten. Many Egyptian gods were heavily associated with particular cities, Sobek for Crocodilopolis, Amun for Thebes, and Ptah for Memphis. If Aten were to be exalted above every other deity, it would certainly need its own domain. The perfect site was to be found by the king in Middle Egypt, a vast, unoccupied tract of land unclaimed by any other cult. Akhenaten named this newfound settlement Akhetaten, meaning the horizon of Aten. This city is now known as Amarna, and hence this period is known as the Amarna period. A few years later, when the city was well established, the king performed his said festival, but his was radically different from his forebears. The said festival was usually meant to emphasize the one-off rejuvenation of the king, but Akhenaten signified the permanent rebirth of the pharaoh and the universe as a whole, the literal beginning of a wholly new way of life. Because the Aten sun disk gave its power through the sun's rays, the new temples erected by Akhenaten were open air, with tables for the god's direct consumption. Akhenaten himself wrote a long hymn to the Aten, which survives completely intact to this day. Though behind the pomp and circumstance, a much darker image may be found. Archaeological research has shown that more than half of the occupants of Akhenaten's great city died in their teenage years, toiling away for royal building projects and living in cramped conditions with poor diets. This stood in stark contrast to the state propaganda of a thriving city under a benevolent sun god. Once Akhetaten became the official state capital, the king ordered his henchmen to search the country and destroy the statues and names of any other god they found. Akhenaten believed that he and his family alone had the privilege of a relationship with the Aten. This was the culmination of the reputation of the Egyptian monarchy accrued over the past few reigns. This was a terrible time to be an Egyptian. Egypt, and especially its new capital, effectively became police states. However, tragedy soon struck the royal family. Akhenaten's second daughter, Meketaten, died at the age of 7. At this point, the Queen Nefertiti disappears from the official record. Instead, she became Neferuaten, and became sole ruler after Akhenaten's death. But with the religious fanatic king finally gone, the Amun priesthood put a young boy on the throne to do their bidding. He was Akhenaten's 9-year-old son, Tutankhaten, which means living image of the Aten. He was married off to his half-sister Ankhesenpa'aten in order to strengthen his claim. The Amun priesthood's control over the new king became clear with the name change. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, and Ankhesenpa'aten became Ankhesenamun, which means she lives for Amun. Tutankhamun restored the priesthoods of Egypt's old gods, and sent the temples new cult statues as a sign of goodwill. Alas, the boy died a mysterious death before he reached adulthood, and was buried in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings, which would be discovered 3,244 years later, and reveal some of the most priceless and beautiful art to survive from the new kingdom. His sister wife, Ankhesenamun, was now the last surviving descendant of Akhenaten, and by extension the entire Thutmose line. Nonetheless, she was forced to marry a man old enough to be her grandfather, and then she disappeared from the record. Egypt had been thrown into turmoil, and Egyptians faced an uncertain future. The great dynasty of Amenhotep III and Thutmose I, among others, met an inglorious end. For most of Egypt's history, the pharaoh called on conscript armies and mercenaries either to launch a sporadic raid or defend against one. But at the start of the new kingdom, a professional army was created, and the institution's influence had grown ever since. Now was the perfect moment for the military to step in and restore order. Horemheb was a general under Akhenaten, and after Ai's brief reign, he installed himself as pharaoh. He immediately began to erase the Amarna period from history, destroying Akhenaten's temples and statues and erasing Tutankhamun's name wherever he could. Horemheb was a man steeped in military discipline, and he organized a new law code to punish corrupt palace officials and local governors. The pharaoh had brought back order and stability to a weakened country. To secure his succession, he appointed a general as his co-regent and heir. Paramessu must have reminded Horemheb of himself. They were both tough, self-made military men with great ambition. As Horemheb neared the end of his reign, Paramessu was given royal titles such as hereditary prince, and changed his name to Ramessu, better known as Ramses. Horemheb eventually died, and Ramses became Ramses I. This was the beginning of the legendary 19th dynasty. Ramses I was already an old man, however, and the crown soon passed to his son, Seti I. Now that Egypt was secure, Seti could focus on seeing it prosper. He commissioned a beautiful new temple at Abju, also known as Abydos. This temple included shrines to all of Egypt's most important national deities, and to the pharaoh himself. However, the most important work here is the famous Abydos Kings List, which is one of the most valuable historical sources to survive from ancient Egypt. Seti was, as stated above, an ardent military commander. While Akhenaten had been imposing his monotheistic cult on Egypt, the Anatolian kingdom of the Hittites defeated the Mitanni and seized some of Egypt's holding in the Near East. Seti decided on action, and struck into Palestine, capturing Kadesh and the region of Amurru. However, as soon as Seti turned his back, Kadesh came under Hittite control once again. After Seti I came one of Egypt's most celebrated and unique pharaohs. He represented the pinnacle of the Ramses dynasty and indeed the new kingdom as a whole. His name was Ramses II, and he immediately marched off to Kadesh following his coronation. His army was divided into 4 divisions, each named after an important national god. Ramses himself was in charge of the Amun division. Kadesh was surrounded on all sides by water. To the south, the town's inhabitants dug a canal to turn their city into an island. Ramses set up camp to the northwest of Kadesh. After intercepting some Hittite spies, the pharaoh learned that the Hittite army was camped behind Kadesh, preparing to attack. Ramses sent a cry for help from the division of Ta, which began heading northward. As the division of Ra was making its way to the camp, it was flanked by the Hittites, who dealt them a heavy blow with their fearsome chariots and chased them to the pharaoh's campsite. Ramses jumped into his chariot, and neither side could defeat the other. Thankfully, however, the Egyptians had planned ahead, and were soon bolstered by the reinforcements who had arrived by sea. The Hittite king Muwatalli II decided to send another wave of chariot reinforcements at the Egyptians. These too were repulsed. The Hittites thus began a humiliating retreat, but both sides had suffered badly. The battle was not over just yet. The next morning, both armies met in front of the town itself, but neither could achieve a breakthrough. The Hittite king sent an envoy to the Egyptian camp, and both sides signed a ceasefire. Despite the uncertain outcome of the famous battle, Ramses decided to start a barrage of propaganda, portraying it as a glorious victory led by a pharaoh in the mold of Ahmose and Amenhotep III. He had so many images drawn and descriptions written that we are now able to reconstruct the events of the battle in great detail. With the peace treaty, Ramses directed his attention to making his mark on Egypt. Literally, in fact, as he had his name inscribed on almost every temple in Egyptian-controlled territories, and made sure to have it carved so deep into the stone that it would be impossible to erase. He continued the destruction of Akhenaten's memory, using the stones from the old temples of Aten to build his new monuments. He added to the Luxor temple west of Thebes, constructing 2 massive seated statues of himself outside the facade of the temple. By far his most famous project is his temple at Abu Simbel, known for the 4 colossal statues of Ramses II flanking the front entrance. Each of these statues measures more than 70 feet tall. Deep within the temple was the Holy of Holies, where there were 4 shrines to each of Egypt's most important gods: Ta, Ra-Harakti, Amun, and the deified Ramses the Great. After these impressive works, he decided to end with the construction of his mortuary temple near Thebes, known as the Ramesseum. Inside the second court of this temple was another gigantic statue of the great pharaoh. Its discovery led the great English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley to write a beautiful critique against absolute power. Ramses' father Seti I had built a palace near the old Hyksos capital of Hutwaret, and Ramses constructed an entire city around this building. He named it Per-Ramses, meaning the House of Ramses. It was a truly cosmopolitan city, and it even featured a temple to Ashtarta, not an Egyptian deity, but the Syrian goddess of love and war. It is likely around this time that the Jewish Exodus occurred, as the first chapter of the book of Exodus speaks of the Hebrews being put to work in Per-Ramses and Per-Atum. The location of the new capital also aided in Ramses' ongoing campaigns in the Near East. The pharaoh returned to Palestine, ending rebellions and shoring up Egypt's control of its imperial holdings. Ramses took back the region of Amurru, but the Hittites were preoccupied with a succession crisis after King Muwatalli II's death, and a more pressing concern, namely the expanding Assyrian Empire, persuaded the Hittites to send a peace envoy to the Egyptians. Thus, the Hittites and Egyptians created and signed the world's first non-aggression pact. Egypt returned the region of Amurru, and relations between the two kingdoms flourished. This friendly relationship would last until the very fall of the Hittites' empire. Ramses the Great was followed by his 13th son Merinptah, who learned alongside his father the art of war. Early in his reign, he defeated a Libyan invading force which was augmented by a growing threat, the Sea Peoples. These pirates and raiders were warriors from across the Near East and Aegean, always willing to fight for whomever promised the most in return. Soon after his victory over the Western invaders, he famously marched into Palestine and massacred what seemed like a small and irrelevant people, known as the Tribe of Israel. The known world was in flux, and Egypt again faced an uncertain future. Ramses the Great's absurd amount of children predictably caused a succession crisis soon after his reign. Merinptah's son Seti fought against one of his cousins named Amenmesse for the throne. Amenmesse initially gained the upper hand, but Seti eventually emerged victorious. His builders soon got to work, hastily preparing for him a small tomb. He was an old man when he became king, and died 2 years into his reign. One of his trusted advisors named Bai committed a treacherous act, appointing the son of Seti's old rival Amenmesse as king. The wife of Seti II, Tawasret, rose to power and had the young pharaoh and the traitor both executed. Her reign was also very short, as officials elsewhere in the country supported a military coup. Just as Horemheb restored order after the Amarna period, Sethnakht likewise brought stability to Egypt after a period of instability. His legacy was secured by his son and heir Ramses III, often considered the last great pharaoh of Egypt. Ramses III became king at a very tumultuous moment in history. All across the Mediterranean, cities were being sacked by hordes of the so-called Sea Peoples. Such famous cities as Ashkelon, Kadesh, Ashdod, and the legendary city of Troy fell to this onslaught. Even Egypt's greatest ally, the mighty Hittite Empire, ultimately fell. There remained only one great naval power in the Near East, and the Sea Peoples had their sights set on it. As one army came against the Nile Delta from the northeast, another attacked the Delta by sea, hoping to overpower the great Egyptian army. On land, the losses were staggering, but the Egyptians managed to hold their enemy back. While at sea, the Egyptians drew them near the shore and showered their ships with arrows, while the Egyptian navy surrounded them. This commanding victory over the Sea Peoples proved to be the swan song of the new kingdom. Ramses then followed the mold of an Egyptian pharaoh, erecting a monument to his great triumph and honoring the gods by surveying and refurbishing every temple in the country. But Egypt had not returned to normal, as the pharaoh stuck his head in the sand and celebrated an extravagant jubilee which the government could barely afford. Workers across the land led numerous strikes. There was even a failed attempt by the pharaoh's inner circle to oust him from the throne. Following his death was a series of largely non-effectual rulers. First came Ramses IV, who begged the gods for a reign of 134 years. He ended up with half a dozen. Ramses V discovered the rampant corruption in the priesthoods and government, but succumbed to smallpox after only 5 years on the throne. Egypt's economy was at the lowest it had been in centuries. Egypt was faltering militarily as well. Unable to defend his Near Eastern possessions, Ramses VI abandoned the hard-won territories of his ancestors, so ending the Egyptian Empire. The next two pharaohs passed very briefly, leaving almost no mark on history. The government was losing its hold on Egypt quickly. In Thebes, the high priest of Amun had set up a de facto hereditary monarchy, thus the pharaoh had effectively lost control over all of Upper Egypt. In 1091 BC, this monarchy was overthrown by the disgruntled citizens of Thebes, and the current high priest Amenhotep called on Ramses IX for help. The pharaoh had a difficult decision to make. Were he to allow the rebellion to go unchecked, he would be admitting his inability to control his own country. However, reinstating a de facto monarchy in Thebes which had grown its power base at the pharaoh's expense was not a desirable outcome either. In the end, Ramses XI swallowed his pride and opted to reinstate the status quo. He ordered his viceroy Penesi to march north and defeat the rebels at Thebes. The viceroy soon re-established order and reinstated Amenhotep as the high priest. But he remained in Thebes, growing his power base and becoming the de facto ruler of Upper Egypt. Being of the stock that he was, the pharaoh opted for a military confrontation to unseat his former ally. One of the pharaoh's northern generals, Payonk, was ordered to march south to Thebes, but Ramses had merely replaced one problematic general with another. Payonk now set up a hereditary monarchy in Upper Egypt, and the nation was all but officially divided into two halves. The same army which gave the Ramses dynasty its reputation eventually led to its downfall. The new kingdom, admired for its artwork and architecture, great and lesser pharaohs, came to a disgraceful end.